welcome everybody. My name is Dave Bailey. I want to thank you for joining us. This is Grief and Grace. Like everyone, I've had my own deep personal experience with grief, and in my work with the largest provider of funeral services in North America, I spend time with grieving families on a daily basis. And so out of that awareness, this Facebook Live was created to be one of the spaces and one of the voices to help process a little bit of that common human experience. And if you know someone that you think could benefit from the ideas that we're talking about here, why don't you go ahead and tag them in the comments so that they get a notification and then they can come and join us. Also, if you have questions during the show, just put them in the comments and we'll take some time to answer as many of them as we can before we sign off. One of the things that we've tried to do on this show is to bring you different insights into all the many facets of grief. And tonight, we're going to look at an aspect that we've never considered before, children in grief. And my guest is Jana DeCristofaro from the Dougy Center in Portland, Oregon. And Jana is a licensed clinical social worker and the Community Response Program Coordinator at the Dougy Center, and the host of the Grief Out Loud podcast. And I'm honored to have you with us today. So welcome.
Thank you so much, Dave, for having me on the show today.
Yes, I'm very excited about it. Very excited about it. Listen, so let's start with this. Why don't you share a little bit about yourself, the Dougy Center, and the role that you play there?
Yeah, so the Dougy Center's been around since 1982. We were the first program in North America to start providing peer support groups for kids and teens who had had a parent or a sibling or a primary caregiver in their life die. Prior to the Dougy Center, there really wasn't a lot available for kids and teens who were grieving a death, and especially not kids and teens who wanted to be in the room with other kids and teens who were grieving. Even today, it's not unusual for a child or a teen to have a parent or a sibling die, to go to school, and to not know that anyone else in their class maybe is also grieving.
Yes.
Even though, the recent statistics have shown that about 1 in 17 kids in Oregon will experience the death of a parent or a sibling before they turn 18, and that number is 1 in 14 for across the country. So
wow, that's higher than I thought it would be. That's amazing.
Yeah, and to think like average class size, which I'm sure today is like 45, there's going to be 2 or 3 other kids in the classroom with you who have also had that type of death.
Yes.
And you may never know. And so grief itself can be so isolating, and then to not know there's other folks your own age going through the same thing, like doubly isolating. So the Dougy Center was really founded on this idea that bringing kids and teens together who have had a similar experience, even though grief is so different for everyone, and giving them the opportunity to talk together, to play together, to just be with one another, can provide so much community and connection and really decrease that sense of isolation. So back in 1982, we started with 4 kids in the basement of our founder, Bev Chappell's house. They had a dusty punching bag and some blue shag carpet. And from that first group, the Dougy Center has grown into what we are today, which is having, well, in the before times, before COVID-19, 3 in-person locations in the greater Portland area, serving over 550 kids and teens every month walking through the doors of our program.
550 unique kids?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah, and we have groups for kids who've had someone die. So those are going to be kids anywhere from 3 up to 18. And then there's groups for the corresponding adult who comes with them. So that might be a grandparent, a parent, an auntie, an uncle, their mentor, anyone in their life who's coming with them. And they have 2 separate groups, one for the kids, one for the adults. And we also have groups for young adults, 18 to 25 and 26 to 40, which I know 40 might be kind of a stretch for the term young adult in a lot of places, but here in Portland it works really well. Mm-hmm. And then groups for the adults. And then about 5 years ago, we started a program called Pathways, and that is a program specifically for families when someone has an advanced serious illness. So those could be kids and teens who have a parent or a sibling who has an illness that is going to shorten the course of their life. And so groups for kids, groups for teens, groups for the adults who are the caregiver, and groups for the adults who have the illness themselves. So bereavement groups and our Pathways program And then we also provide training and consultation for programs similar to ours around the country and the world, to individual counselors, to anyone who's really wanting to learn how to support grieving kids and teens.
Wow.
So that's the kind of the Dougy Center overall. And I think you asked me about me, but depends on what you want to know, because I've got a lot I could say.
There you go. Let me ask you this first. So someone walks in the door of the Dougy Center. What does it cost them?
$0. So no cost for any family who wants to attend a group at the Dougy Center, whether in person, when we can resume doing in-person groups, or currently our virtual groups. So we recognize that there can be tremendous financial insecurity for families who have had someone die, but also for families prior to when someone dies, either because someone had a long-term illness or they're facing other economic disparities in their life. So we don't want to add any stress of having to pay to attend in a support group. So free of charge to any family who comes through the doors.
Wow. Wow, that's amazing. I'm going to ask you about you, but just so you know and don't feel any pressure whatsoever, I see in the comments that your parents are watching. So, yeah, just so you know, no pressure whatsoever.
No pressure.
Tell us a little bit about you. How long have you been at the Dougy Center, and what do you do there?
So I started at the Dougy Center as a volunteer, and I was a volunteer for about six months, I think, and then a job came open. And that's a very rare occurrence at the Dougy Center. Most people who work at the Dougy Center stay there a very long time. And I thought, there's no way these people are going to hire me. Like, I'm so new to the social work world, but I'll try anyways. And shockingly, they hired me, which I'm super grateful for. And so as of May of this year, I've been there 18 years.
Wow.
So it's really been my only grown-up job that I've ever had. And I feel like I've really grown up at the Dougy Center. I came from a social work background, and I really had the idea that I wanted to do individual counseling and therapy. That was my goal going into grad school as like a baby 22-year-old. So I really didn't know what I was doing. And I came out of grad school terrified of trying to do individual or family therapy, and thought, well, I'll just do research because I'm good with numbers and it doesn't involve people. But eventually I was just missing actually connecting with human beings. So that's how I discovered the Dougy Center, and the model that we have around providing peer support, and the fact that we're not here to fix people or change people or even really give them prescriptive advice about what they need to be doing. We're here to create a container where they can connect with others who are going through something similar and find their own way into what works for them. That was just a huge relief for me to realize that I needed to create safety and connection. I didn't need to create a roadmap for what people needed to do with their lives, because at that point I barely knew what I was doing with my life. So who was I to tell anybody what to do? So the model really felt like it aligned with who I was and how I wanted to do this work.
Wow. So before we center in on children and grief, I've heard you say that grief isn't something that needs to be fixed or healed, but something people need to learn to integrate and carry with them, whatever that means for them. Could you maybe unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not only is grief not something that needs to be fixed, I don't think grief is something that can be fixed. I mean, I think when someone in our life dies, regardless of the relationship we have with them, oftentimes there's a stereotype that when someone dies, it's a loved one. We had this amazing relationship and we're grieving because we had such a good relationship. But we know that people have someone in their life die, and maybe it was not a good relationship, or it was a very conflicted relationship, or it was an estranged relationship, and that person dies, and there's still tons of grief that somebody might go through. And they may feel extra isolated in that because people think like, oh, well, you weren't really close to your dad, or you and your mom had a falling out 20 years ago. What does it matter that she's died? So that's a whole other tangent. But thinking about the idea that grief is something that we experience when there's any change in our life. So we can grieve over the fact that someone has died. We can grieve over the loss of a job or the loss of a relationship, the loss of our house, the loss of a sense of security, which many of us are experiencing right now in the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's a natural response. It's a normal response to grieve and miss and make sense of what does it mean to not have this thing or this person or their situation in our life anymore. And so that's what I mean by carrying it forward and integrating it. Because for someone to say to me, your person has died, we need to fix this grief. I take that as you need to eradicate any remnant of connection with this person who meant something to you.
Yes.
whether it was a positive connection or a challenging connection. And that just seems unfair. Like, how do I pull this person out of my molecular structure and my memory structure? And instead, it's like, how do I carve out space to carry that relationship with me going forward, even if this person is not here in their physical form? How do I honor who they were in my life? How do I honor who they continue to be in my life? And how do I honor how my life is different and changed because they were in my life and because they're no longer physically present in my life? And so that's too much to try to fix. It's not like a flat tire. Just change that out. And so I think giving people permission to say, you don't have to fix this. It's okay if 10, 20, 40, 50 years from now, you think of that person and you still have that hitch in your heart, or that dropping feeling in your stomach, or a memory comes that just sort of takes your breath away. People give themselves such a hard time for that happening because we don't have a great understanding that grief is something that we take with us and integrate. So there's a lot of different terms out there for what that looks like to integrate the grief, in terms of David Kessler and Robert Niemeyer talk about like finding meaning and meaning making. And so that's one way of thinking about it. And I just think, like, how do I make room to take this person with me, whatever form that's going to look like.
Yeah, because I think one of the such a hurtful thing that we say to people is, really encourage you to get over this, or get through this even, like that somewhere there's an end, you're in a tunnel, there's the other side, and when you come out of that tunnel, you won't experience it anymore. I love that you integrate it into your life. It now becomes part of who you are, part of who you'll become going forward. I think it's very cool.
And we have a job in that too, those of us who are in a support role, whether it's a friend support, a family support, a professional support. In that, Megan Devine talks about when people aren't able to be with you in your pain, it doesn't mean the pain goes away. They just stop talking to you about it. And I think, what a painful...
Just say that again. That is good. Say that again.
Yeah, I'm quoting Megan Devine.
Yeah, but it's good. Yeah.
When she talks about how if someone says or responds in a way that makes you feel like your pain is not safe with them, they don't want to hear about your pain, or they try to cheer you up, it doesn't make the pain go away. It just means they stop talking to you about it. Wow. And for a lot of people in grief, they don't have anyone that they feel like they can really talk to about the pain or the joy or the celebration, because people get uncomfortable or awkward, or they don't know what to do. They want to show up, but they just don't have a lot of experience with doing that. And so our role is like, how do we create room in a society where people can talk about their pain and have that pain be seen, acknowledged, validated? That to me makes it easier to carry, rather than saying you really shouldn't feel that way.
Yes, so totally. I see Kelly Lynn, who was my guest last week, just logged on, and I was reading her book. We were talking about it last week, and she talked about a 3 and 4 and 5 year journey through some really intense grief. And people start falling off somewhere along the line. They're like, well, I can walk with you for 6 months, or I can walk with you for a year, or I can walk with you for 2 years, but aren't you over this yet? Haven't you gotten past this yet? And you're right. I think those are the kind of people you just stop talking to. You can't be vulnerable with those people anymore.
I think too about how there's people who show up at different time periods too, right? Like there may be folks in the immediacy of the death who are so good at setting up meal trains, and they're really good at showing up and doing tangible things and helping you get organized. But maybe they may not have the same skill set as someone who can be there 2, 3, 4 years out with just the sitting and the presence. And so finding the people who can do the different roles, and that's the main tenet of Dougy Center too, is that our groups are ongoing. And it's exactly for that reason, that if you're having a hard time finding folks in your life and your family and your friends and your colleagues who can be there over the long haul, you can come to the Dougy Center and talk about your person who died, tell us your memories of them, tell us your challenges, tell us your celebrations for as long as you want to, and as long as you find it to be helpful. And we will respond with the same degree of presence no matter how long it has been.
Yes. Wow. So, talk to me about this. How does the grief that children and teens experience differ from adult grief? And in which ways are they similar?
Well, I love this question, in that I think the grief is not different, right? The person died, the grief is the same. But how we think about the grief, how we process that grief, what it means for our life at different stages, what our cognitive capacity is for making sense of that loss can be really different. So if you have a 3-year-old and their person has died, 3-year-olds, cognitively are not really in the place where they understand that death is permanent, that death is universal, that it happens to everyone. And so you might have a 3-year-old saying out loud a lot like, okay, I know you said mommy died, but she's going to come home tomorrow, right? And you say, no, sweetie, remember, mommy died. That means we won't see her again. Her body stopped working. We can look at her pictures and we can look at her clothes and we can hug the teddy bear she gave you, but we won't see her again because she's died. And then the next day, okay, I know mommy was dead yesterday, but is she going to come back on Wednesday? Because on Wednesday, we always went to the park. So that's that 3-year-old being like, I don't understand this permanence. But I don't know if I've met anyone who is of any age who doesn't have those moments of, I swore when I walked in the door today, she was going to be there. I mean, I know she's dead, but I still think maybe she's on vacation. And so I think there's remnants of that. How can this be real? But it's just so tangible for a younger child. Other things we might see as like adults are, and I don't know if this is inherent to us as adults or something we've been socialized to do, but we tend to like just get into that grief, it's just like in it. And kids are like in and out of the expression of the grief, not necessarily in and out of the reality that their person has died, but in and out of, I need a lot of attention and I'm having a big emotional response right now, and now I'm going to play soccer, which could also be part of their emotional response. So for adults, it can be confusing, I think, when the kids in their lives are seemingly fine one second and then having a big reaction the next. Which, again, I would offer adults do the same thing, right? Like we go to work, we show up, we put on our work face, and then we go to the bathroom during a break and we have a big emotional response. But it just looks different for adults than it does for kids. And so I think, kids are dealing with those developmental pieces. Teens are in that place of learning to differentiate. A lot of identity development is happening for them. And so they are doing that identity development in the new reality of maybe somebody who was a big part of their identity has died. And so they're trying to figure out, who am I? What do I value? And that person that maybe they would have been in alignment with or in opposition to is no longer there to be in alignment with or in opposition to, which can confuse things for a lot of teens. So in general, with kids, you're going to see short bursts. You're going to see very physical reactions. So behavioral reactions, stomach aches, headaches, coughs, colds, feeling tired, needing a lot of physical reassurance and connection with the adults in their life. Teens, you might see more of that emotional variance and also them turning to peers or to others for support. And so that's another thing that can be confusing for an adult if they have a 4-year-old and a 14-year-old, and the 14-year-old is like, I'm not talking to you about this. And the 4-year-old won't leave you alone. It's just like following you around the house all the time. And so for a lot of teens, it's a natural developmental phase for them to be turning to their peers, but also they feel the charge. They sit down with the other adult in their life and they're talking about the same person who's died. They can feel the intensity of that, and it can be a little overwhelming. And so they talk with their friends, they come to a peer support group, they talk with people who didn't know their person. There's a lot more opportunity and buffer there to kind of get into their emotions without having to navigate. Like if I'm in their group, they don't have to navigate my emotional response the way they would with another adult in their life. So those are some basics, I would say, in terms of kids and teens, but I just don't think the lines are that clear in terms of kid grief and adult grief.
Interesting. I have a friend whose husband passed away from brain cancer a couple of years ago. She had at that stage, it was a 8-year-old and a 3-year-old, or not quite 3. And so they've been navigating the loss of their dad for almost 2.5 years. And I was with them the other day at a water park. And we're kind of going around the lazy river, and the now 5-year-old is hanging out with another 5-year-old on a floaty just ahead, and starts talking, and she looks at this other 5-year-old and says, "My dad's dead, you know." And I see this 5-year-old get this look on her face, like, start looking around like, what? She says, "Oh yeah, Everybody dies. Even flowers die. My dad's dead. And then just goes right back to playing. And I'm like, what did I just witness here? It was...
Yeah, it's such a great example of how I think we get socialized over time into other people's discomfort around the topic of grief and loss. And so a 3 or 4 or 5-year-old, they tell everybody, oh, my dad died. Did you know my dad died? Did your dad die? Who else's dad die? And they're doing that in a world that has learned over time, like, we don't talk about that, or that's uncomfortable. And so when you've got those kids who are 3 to 5, they're in a group together, they say, this one time this kid's like, I miss my dad. I just want my dad to come back. He's crying. And another little kid gets up, toddles across the group room to him and says, when dads die, they don't come back. And then goes back. And then they're all like, okay, we're ready to go play.
All right then. Well, that clarified everything for me.
And so they're speaking the same, not so much the same language, but they're speaking the same cognitive understanding. Yes. And they can really connect with one another and respond in that, like, oh yeah, I get it. And not that like, oh my gosh, what just happened?
Yeah. I love the phrase that you use. We get socialized into other people's discomfort. That's a pretty big phrase. That's a pretty big phrase. So young children, as we talked about, obviously don't have the verbal skills to express grief, but there might be behaviors that would give us a clue that they're at this point right now struggling with that grief in some ways. And so how do you differentiate between misbehavior and the acting out as a grief response?
Yeah, that's another favorite question of mine, because I always want to respond with, what would be different about your response if you knew this was normal misbehavior, or if you knew this was grief acting out? What would be different about your response as the parent to, or the caregiver of, or the supporter of a grieving child? And, I like to start there of thinking you have a grieving child who's acting the way they're acting. And so I don't know how helpful it is to make that differentiation in terms of being able to show up for a child who's having some sort of adaptive response. And so they may be having an adaptive response to feeling frustrated that they aren't able to do something. And they may be having an adaptive response to the fact that their person has died. But even if they're having an adaptive response to being frustrated that they aren't able to do something, they're doing that in the context of having had someone in their life die.
Yes.
So that's always layered on top of it. And so I think more about what are the behaviors we're seeing? What is the need that is being expressed? How do we access and understand what that need is and try to help meet that need, or help a child meet their own need? When we are looking for things is, when does the grief behavior or the grief reaction start to move into a place that's requiring some additional professional support? So if you have a child who, it's like I said, it's really common to have some physical reactions, and so sleep might get disturbed, eating habits might change, wanting to engage with people might change. And so if you're seeing that over the course of time in such a way that it's really interrupting daily functioning or the ability to participate in their life, that's going to be a time when it's helpful to reach out to a peer support group or a counselor or a therapist, or somebody who can either coach you as a parent and a caregiver, or to talk directly with your child. And of course, any thoughts or expressions or talking about wanting to die or hurt themselves or harm themselves in any way, that's like hard stop. We need to be reaching out to at least do an assessment. But again, it's like always asking parents and caregivers, like, would you have less empathy if you knew your child was just misbehaving than you would if you knew it, or would you let it slide because you knew it was grief? So there's an importance of still having expectations in your household of raising children with an understanding and empathy about the fact that they're grieving. So that looks like expectation with flexibility, which I know is vague and really, like, I know they're like, just tell me what to do, and that's super vague, but that's the best sort of foundational response I can give.
No, I love that, because I love that the fact that you said that you use the phrase adaptive response, and in some ways all behavior is an adaptive response to whatever kind of stimulus is happening around us, but especially when you have this grief piece that enters, and now you have, as you said, you have that layered over top of everything. But when you ask yourself that question, would I respond any differently. What you're asking yourself is you're asking yourself about compassion. Would I have less compassion or more compassion? Or should my default response be compassion, but also concern? Yes, this is outside of my lane. This I need some help with. This I need some coaching with. This I need some whatever with. So I love that. I love that question. It's great. So what are, in your experience, what would you consider some of the best practices when it comes to supporting children and teens in the grief process?
So I think about that from a couple different levels, right? There's the immediate family members who are offering support. There's school system that's offering support, and then there's support groups that are offering support, and then there's professionals offering support. So I don't think we have time to go through all of those, but I think specifically, from the Dougy Center's perspective and our support groups, the things that we're considering are how do we create safety, both emotional and physical? How do we create opportunity for connection? How do we create opportunities for choice and control in a way? And so what that comes down to for us is when kids come to the Dougy Center, they get to choose when to start coming to a program, to a group. They get to choose when they stop coming to the group. They get to choose what they do while they're at the Dougy Center. We have a variety of different play areas for kids, expression rooms, because we know, as you mentioned, like kids don't always have access to their words to express what they're feeling, just like adults sometimes don't have access to their words. And so we give them opportunities to express themselves through art and through play and through make-believe and things like that. So giving them choices about what they want to do and how they want to express. And then also when it comes time to sharing their story, there's an opportunity for kids every time to tell their story of who they are and who died and how that person died. The biggest rule at the Dougy Center is I pass. You get to say I pass. And so you don't have to say it if you don't want to. And you can still be part of our group and our community. So I think choice is really vital for kids who are grieving because they had no choice in the fact that this person has died. And they oftentimes have little choice over all the changes that are happening in their life. And so just as many of us right now, we don't have a lot of choice of what's happening in the COVID-19 pandemic. And so having little choices along the way help us to feel like, okay, at least I have some agency in this little area of my life. So choice, and then I also think about routine and predictability. And so that goes a long way into creating that safety, emotional and physical safety for kids. We follow the same routine in all of our grief support groups. Every time we do the same routine: opening circle, activity time, play time, closing circle. And there are kids who, if they come in and we skip a step, they definitely tell us. They're like, teacher lady, you forgot this part. So they are very in tune with wanting that. And so do the young adults as well, that structure and that routine, because for so many folks, when they're grieving, everything's changing around them. And so to have this place where like, okay, this is what happens. And so I think about how can you create that in your home as well, in your family or in your extended family, where there's still routines, bedtime routines, wake up routines, meal routines, and then flexibility and choice. So that looks like, okay, we're going to have a story before bedtime. Which story do you want to read tonight? Or do you want story time to start at 6 or 6:15? Giving kids a little bit of flexibility and making those choices tangible. So sometimes it's like, well, what do you want for breakfast? That's like not the best option because you could be there all morning trying to make whatever it is that they've asked for. But to say like, we have cereal, we have eggs, and we have toast. Which of those 3 things would you like? So predictability, safety, routine, consistency, and choice, I think, are really important things with grieving kids.
Wow. There are so many little ideas that you said along the way. I was like, oh, we should stop and talk about this. Oh, we should stop and talk about this. So much good stuff. Listen, I'd like to take you to your website. I want people to see your website. Let me see if I can click on it over here. The Dougy Center, and it is dougy.org. It is incredibly packed from top to bottom with a wide variety of resources that you can see there, along with tip sheets, etc. If you go to the top left, you see this graphic here, COVID-19 and grief. If you click on that, that takes you to a School and Community Toolkit, Supporting Grief in a Global Health Crisis. And there's tip sheets and activity sheets, etc. Can you walk us through that a little bit, Jana?
Yeah, and just to help clarify for folks, there is the dougy.org website where a lot of our information exists. And then the School and Community Toolkit was designed specifically for teachers and school counselors and administrators to be able to access quickly the information that's specific for them. But from that original imagination, we've also grown that page to have a variety of resources related to other things that are connected to grief. And there's also pages on that School and Community Toolkit specifically for kids and teens. So if you have a child or a teen at home, or if you're a teacher of one, you can send them to that page, and there's information specifically for them. And then a series of activity sheets they can download, and some short video clips that they can watch. So that's just a little aside about what's available on that website. And then on the page here, the specific COVID-19 one, these are all resources we've created since March. And we really wanted to offer some things that would be specific for families, either families who have grief that they're carrying into the situation, or families who are experiencing new grief because of COVID-19. So yeah, there's that activity sheet. That's great for kids and teens. That's in that top left bubble there. Yeah. It's also available in Spanish. And then there's a series of tip sheets. Our latest one is the Back to School with Grief and the COVID-19 Pandemic, that also talks about like supporting kids who had someone die. They're going back to school. Now they're doing that in the midst of COVID-19, and also in the context of increased news coverage of racism and racist violence, and the recent murders of Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd. And so thinking about that as another layer for kids who are grieving. So there's that tip sheet. And then the next one is our When Your World is Already Upside Down. And that's great ideas on family and self-care and ways to still attend to grief during this COVID-19 pandemic. Because what we've heard from a lot of families who have that grief that they carried into this experience is their grief feels kind of shoved aside. Yes. Because everybody's talking about grief now. Yes. And it's the grief of not being able to go on my summer vacation, and the grief of possibly losing my house, and the grief of being cut off from my family, and also the grief of maybe not being able to see someone if they're dying in a facility. And then those folks who are like, we've been grieving for years, and now everyone's talking about grief, but our grief is getting shoved aside. Or those folks who had really well-established routines for taking care of themselves in their grief, and they are now cut off from those. So there's great ideas on that one, also available in Spanish. And then we have one that's specifically for supporting kids and teens when someone they care about is dying in a hospital or a care facility, and they may not be able to go see them in person. So there's some ideas of ways that they can have connection and share gratitude and appreciation. That's also in Spanish. And then there's one for youth who are in foster care during this COVID-19 pandemic, and thinking about the ways that they may also are being affected by this. And then the other one in there is we wrote up some sample scripts for schools if they're needing to notify their community that someone has died of COVID-19. So sometimes it's helpful just to see, like, what would I say? Yes. So that's a great one there. And then past the tip sheets, we have a couple of Grief Out Loud podcast episodes that are specific to COVID-19 that might be helpful for people. And then a list of some webinars that Dougy Center staff has been a part of, blogs and interviews like this one that we've been a part of, and then other resources from organizations who've been putting out some really great, helpful information for families during this time.
Wow, it's amazing. And when you click through on one of these tip sheets, let me just click through on this one. When their world is already upside down, supporting children and teens in foster care. When you click through to one of these, what you get is a whole group of really practical ideas, whatever that might be. As you can scroll down and see all the different ideas and tips, etc. So, and then let's go back to the front page, and you can tell us about this. Down here on the left-hand side, you'll see this Grief Out Loud. That's your podcast. Jana, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So Grief Out Loud started about 5.5 years ago, and we started the podcast because we realized we have these services for folks who are coming to the Dougy Center now. They live in the greater Portland area. There are people who have had a death maybe within the last 5 years or so. But then we started thinking, like, what about the people who live all over the country and all over the world who don't have access to a grief support program? And what about folks who maybe they're in their 70s now, but they were 4 when their dad died and they never had a chance to find connection and community around that loss? How can we support them? So we started putting out these episodes of talking about some of the basics of grief, interviewing people about different topics of grief, all in the hopes of creating this sort of virtual community long before everything was virtual, which is where we are now. And I've just been so grateful for the opportunity, because we have people who are listening from all over the world. We just got a review today from someone in New Zealand who talked about how helpful listening to the guests and connecting to their stories has been so useful for them and their grief.
And you have 160 episodes at this stage?
I just published episode 159 about 10 minutes before I hopped on here with you. So, yeah.
So there's lots of resources there. If someone is looking for resources, go to the website. The website, I'll put it up again later, but the website is dougy.org, and you can find you can find all that resources there. Wow. One more question. I know we got to end this. We're kind of running over time. But if I said to you, what one thing would you tell me? If you had to just choose one thing, or what's the most important thing that you could say to me about grief, or about children in grief, or about supporting children in grief?
Well, I'm not going to say the most important, because I can't pick that, but I'm going to say an important thing that I was thinking about today. How does that sound?
That's great.
Okay. So
I'll let you off that hook.
Okay, thank you. I've been thinking a lot about, like, in this time of COVID-19, we've been having to have a lot of hard conversations with one another of what we're comfortable with, what our boundaries are, and we're having to go out in the world oftentimes prepped with what we're going to say if someone crosses one of those boundaries. I think about, like, I always like to have a catchphrase in case someone comes too close to me or doesn't have a mask on or whatever it is that's happening, so I'm not caught off guard as much. And I think anything we can do to have a couple of pre-planned out phrases for when someone unexpectedly tells us that someone in their life has died or that they're grieving, so that we're not caught so off guard. Because when we're caught off guard, we revert to what we've been socialized to do, which is what we've been taught through books and movies and other things, which might just be I'm sorry for your loss, or whatever it might be. And so thinking ahead of, like, what are some things I might say. And here's a quick story about that. I was out camping this weekend. I was at a river, and a couple drove up. They looked to be maybe in their 70s or their 80s, and they were wanting to kind of be in the space where we were. We weren't really sure what was happening around that. And eventually it came out they were there to spread the ashes of their son.
Whoa.
And they wanted to let us know that if we saw flower petals go by, that's what was happening. Which, in the moment, I'm like, I just want to be like, here, come take our space. But instead I was like, pause, try not to say something stereotypical, and instead remember, what do I know about parents who have had children die? They want someone to ask about their child. Yes. They want to be able to say their child's name.
Yes, tell me his name. Tell me their name.
I said, oh, what was your son's name? Oh, our son's name was Jesse. I said, oh, is this, what's Jesse's connection to this location? What is it about this river? And then I got to hear about how Jesse loved to go whitewater rafting, and about how this one confluence of the creek and the river was where every time they came here in the summer, that's exactly where he jumped into this freezing cold river to go swimming. And so I left knowing a little bit about Jesse, and they had a chance to tell me. And they didn't have to navigate me saying something like, oh, I'm so sorry for your loss.
Yes.
And then
to which they don't know how to respond. They're like, oh, thank you. And then there is nowhere to go in the conversation after that.
Exactly. And so, and I, just to say, I was caught off guard. I've been doing this for 18 years. I still was like, I have no idea what to say. Yes. But I was like, okay, remember your pre-planned phrases, which was ask their name, ask about a memory, and thank them for telling you about their person and for sharing that moment with you. So that's what I would encourage people to do, is just plan ahead, so you've got something in your back pocket that you can pull out when you're caught off guard.
Wow. That's, thank you. I am just so grateful that you came and shared your time with us tonight. Your generosity of spirit, your wisdom, there was so many roads we could have gone down because it was just filled with wisdom, and I am extraordinarily thankful. I hope you'll come back and be our guest again. We'll talk some more.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. And just to say that the wisdom is not mine. It comes directly from the kids and the teens and the young adults, the adults that I've worked with for 18 years. So I'm just here to like offer up what they've taught me. So thank you for that opportunity.
Yeah, thank you, Jana. And thank you for being here and being a part of tonight. I want you to, let me see if I can bring that up. No, that's not what I wanted to bring up. I want to bring up the Dougy Center. There we go. Dougy.org is the website. Please go and take advantage of all of the resources there. There's so much there that you can read. And the Grief Out Loud podcast, all of that is there for you. So thank you so much. Even after this live is over, please come leave questions or comments, and I'll be coming back to interact with those as we go forward. And don't forget to click on notifications so that you can get a notice of whenever it is that we're going live, and you can come and be a part of this. And if you've gotten value out of this tonight, please feel free to share this on all of your social media platforms, and you can also find these archived on YouTube under the Grief and Grace page. All right, thank you for being here with us tonight. I'll see you next Monday. Stay safe, everybody.